Welcome to C2GTalk, a series of one-on-one interviews with influential practitioners and thought leaders to explore the governance challenges raised by emerging approaches to alter the climate. I'm Mark Turner, Senior Communications Consultant with Carnegie Climate Governance Initiative, and I'm speaking today with Oliver Morton, a prominent science author and journalist who wrote one of the seminal books about geoengineering in 2015, The Planet Remade. Oliver Morton is currently a senior editor at the Economist magazine and was previously chief news and features editor at Nature. Amongst other distinctions, he has an asteroid named after him, Asteroid 10716, Oliver Morton. Oliver, welcome to C2GTalk.
Thanks, Mark. It's lovely to be here.
Brilliant. Well, The Planet Remade, and that was the first book I read, and I think quite a few people read when learning about this field, so thank you. Came out in 2015. At the time, the idea of intentional large-scale intervention in the climate system was still considered rather niche, although subject to a vigorous academic debate. Since its publication, there's been a growing sense of urgency around climate change in general and interest in new approaches to tackle it. How do you see the context has changed since you wrote the book, and in what ways might that change some of the things that you said in the book?
Oh, changing the things I said in the book, I'd have to think quite deeply about that. I think the thing I'm surprised by, actually, the degree to which the debate hasn't progressed. Although, I mean, people say that there's ever more discussion of climate geoengineering, and I'm not entirely sure that's true. Certainly not as a proportion of total climate discussion. I mean, total discussion of the climate has undoubtedly gone up, but largely thanks to sort of like impressive youth movements, which don't have much interest in or much to say about climate geoengineering. And in terms of the actual practicalities of the field, you know, when I wrote that book, the Harvard team was talking about doing a small experiment called ScopeX, and they've built it, but they're still only talking about doing it. There had been no real testing of the technologies that might be used for marine cloud brightening, and that still hasn't kind of happened. And you know, I think that the assessment of solar geoengineering in the IPCC's AR6 was actually pretty desultory compared to what they said in AR5. So although, you know, the issue of solar geoengineering chugs along and people talk about it in some areas quite a lot, I must say I think I'd be slightly surprised that it hasn't taken off. I mean, I just thought, you know, it's like one good book and this field will just explode, and that didn't turn out to be the way it went.
Actually, if I could just jump in quickly, I think it might be helpful because there's such a maze of terms and terminology around all of this, and geoengineering, you know, has been used to cover this vast range of ideas, from different forms of large-scale carbon dioxide removal, both nature-based and technological, and also various ideas to reflect back sunlight to lower the temperature. When you talk about climate geoengineering, which bits are you talking about?
For myself, and except when I forget, when I say climate geoengineering, I mean both carbon geoengineering, which you could call negative emissions or carbon dioxide removal, and solar geoengineering, which might also be called brightening the earth. And although some people would like to separate these things out, and I come across that mostly from people who want to do carbon dioxide removal and don't want to be tarred with the brush of geoengineering, I think it's useful to keep them conceptually linked, because what they have in common is that they both decouple the climate you get from the cumulative emissions to date. And I think that's a really important commonality between them. Now, I understand that various people are kind of scared of the word geoengineering, and so in around 2007, 2008, people started using this horrible circumlocution, solar radiation management, which was actually invented as a joke to make the idea of brightening the earth sound as sort of like bureaucratic and uninteresting as possible. And that term has stuck. So people talk about SRM. Some people don't like, some people who don't like using the term geoengineering like to talk about climate intervention. And I think that's in some ways an interesting, useful thing. But when you ask what intervention are you thinking of, then you say, well, the thing that's really solar geoengineering. And I think my sort of like base level, I think that if people who want to encourage a debate about solar geoengineering try not to use the word geoengineering, then people who want to take the other side on this will say, oh, well, what they're talking about is really geoengineering. So in fact, you'll get the term turn back on itself. So for me, it's stick with what you came with. And since I wrote a book about geoengineering that dealt with both carbon and solar geoengineering, that's still how I think. And I think it's probably off-putting or confusing to the newcomer, but it's not that hard a lexical thing to get through.
And to add one more, we in Carnegie Climate Governance Initiative used the phrase solar radiation modification. We get guided by what the IPCC used in its report. So
yeah, I've always wondered why. I suppose it because management sounded like you could actually do it, but in fact, modification sounds like you'll just have an effect, maybe not the one you're trying to manage. It's interesting that. And then there's also the vexed question of cirrus cloud thinning, which looks very like solar geoengineering, but is a bit different because it's about letting long wave radiation out. But these are all slightly in the weeds. But yes, solar radiation modification, that's what the IPCC and the Carnegie say. And that's very grown up of you all.
So in your book, you identified some, let's take one of these approaches to solar geoengineering, solar radiation modification, known as stratospheric aerosol injection, or stratospheric geoengineering, I think you describe it as in the
sometimes.
So there are potential benefits and costs and trade-offs to this. It could potentially reduce temperatures quickly and relatively affordably, but its deployment could also have uncertain, uneven, and potentially dangerous environmental and social consequences. Do you see that the level of, I mean, you've already said you haven't seen that much more debate on these core ideas since you wrote the book, but do you see at least the level of understanding of some of these challenges as you frame them increase in the years since? Do we see a broader range of people beginning to engage in these ideas and discuss them?
I think there is a broader range, but the broadening is reasonably slow. I mean, so for instance, when we recently saw a volcanic eruption in Tonga, people fairly quickly started saying, is there enough sulfur coming out here to actually have an effect on the stratosphere, and can we study it? And the answer is, well, maybe able to study it, but it won't be a very big effect, if really any. There's been a lot of modeling work. There's been a lot of work in the climate modeling community around a project called GeoMap. There's been work on, as it were, sort of like optimizing or ways of putting sulfur, if it's sulfur you choose to put into the stratosphere. But I don't think there's been anything sort of like, anything that anyone would point to as a sort of like striking breakthrough. And by and large, the results still look as though net, a well-designed solar geoengineering program could significantly reduce harm to quite a lot of people while increasing harm to relatively or possibly absolutely few. So I think that's still more or less where that part of the science sits, but there are both known unknowns, such as what does this warming in the lower stratosphere do to the upper troposphere? What does it do to stratospheric chemistry? And there are also, one assumes, unknown unknowns. And that needs more, that certainly needs more deeper research. But I think there's also, in this sense, something that Donald Rumsfeld never concerned himself with. There's also sort of like an unknown known, which is that the evidence from work so far is that solar geoengineering could have quite significant benefits with relatively low costs in terms of direct geophysically mediated human suffering.
So that's on the physical side of it. How about on the governance side of it? Do you think there's been advances in understanding how humanity in all its complexity and diversity might go about reaching agreements, or to deploy or not to deploy, or to research or not to research? Do you think there's an understanding of the metrics by which different risks can be assessed against each other, and the places those discussions might be had?
Well, there's this organization you may have heard of called C2G, which has been carrying these things forward very nicely. There hasn't been a sort of like breakthrough. There hasn't as yet been anything like, say, the Pew Commission on the Oceans, which was very very sort of like agenda setting and mind clearing when that happened. There haven't been very big discussions in international fora. There was a move to have an assessment program put forward under UNEP, which, as you know, did not get approved. There's still what some people would like to see as a moratorium under the Convention on Biological Diversity, though I think I and most of the lawyers I talk to think that that's not a moratorium in any real sense of the word. But I don't think there have been many new steps. I think more people have become part of the discussion, and in some places, the discussion has, I think, sort of like deepened, probably deepened more than broadened. But without I think it's very hard to understand these issues. One can scope them, and I think that C2G has done great work on that. To actually understand them, I think at some level you have to start working through them. And it was striking. I was at a slightly fringy meeting a couple of years ago, in the great before times, and about about space-based geoengineering, so big mirrors in space, which people talk about now and then, and it's good to talk about things now and then, but at the moment they really do not, to me, look like a practical alternative. But one of the things that was interesting was that if solar geoengineering was done that way, then at least the Outer Space Treaty would provide a really quite firm basis for governing it, because it says what humans are allowed to do in space and what reasons they should do it for. That is to say, basically, the common good of humankind. So it's funny that a technical no-go would at least have the benefit of providing a forum for discussion. And at the moment, there's really not that forum.
Do you think it could be governed internationally in a way that's fair and inclusive?
I'm not sure. I think anything is governed internationally in a way that's fair and inclusive. I think there's, and I'm torn on this, because I think to some extent, what I just said is what people deplore as whataboutery, nothing else. So obviously one would want it to be governed in a fair and inclusive way. But if you think about an end member case of solar geoengineering, which is where one country decides to do it for what it perceives of as its own reasons, there's not really, it's not clear to me how there could be a fair and inclusive way of stopping that country. Because as we are seeing in all sorts of situations around the world, you can't stop sovereign nations from doing things they really want to do. You can increase the cost for them, but again, I think that actually setting up a sanctions regime in such a situation might be quite hard. So I think that moves towards a fair and equitable governance regime would be a very good idea. But I think that it's that process rather than the idea that you will end up with a sort of like ironclad regime that would be more interesting than the end result. I mean, to put it another way, I don't think I put that as clear as I could. If you are faced with what people might call a rogue geoengineer, it's much better to have had the discussion about what a fair and equitable approach to geoengineering is when you are faced with something that isn't one of those, than it is to just start from scratch.
There has been recently some calls by a group of 60 or so academics and scientists for an international non-use agreement for solar geoengineering. The ungovernability was one of the issues. There are a couple of other issues that they raised. Do you think that represents an opening up of this debate in a useful direction?
I think it definitely represents the views of the people who've signed on to it. it's slightly hard for me to see something which calls for instance, international organizations not to give house room to solar geoengineering as a way of opening up the debate. But I do think it's an interesting way to, it may be an interesting way to clarify some of the tensions and contradictions. You know, there are people who've signed that open letter who I've known for years and like and trust and admire. And I know that we have differences, and I'd like to see that discussion go on further as to what they think about other ways of dealing with overshoots. And if they don't have any very strong sense of how to fairly and justly deal with overshoots, it's not clear to me quite on what moral ground they say that although we don't know anything else for this, we ought to not discuss at an international level this possibility.
One of the general critiques around the discussion is that geoengineering and or solar radiation modification and the ideas around it have been dominated by a fairly limited group of people from the north and certain types of people. I think you once characterized this group as the geo clique.
That's actually Eli Kintish's phrase.
Okay, okay. Does that?
I've happily embraced it. Yeah, I think my definition of it is anyone I've had breakfast with more than twice at a geoengineering conference is a member of the geo clique.
So does that still exist in the same way that it did maybe 5 years ago? To what extent does this relatively small group of people still dominate and frame the debate? And how might one go about expanding that to different types of people?
I mean, it has broadened out. One of the things I'd say is really something really good that's happened since I wrote the book in this field is that, you know, you have, as it were, geoengineering native researchers, both in the physical and the social sciences, people whose, you know, there are now people, I mean, you could count them on one hand, I think, but there are now people who did a PhD on a geoengineering topic who are now tenured professors. So, you know, that's something that there never used to be. There basically wasn't anyone, and there's still very few people who work full-time on solar geoengineering. I mean, very few indeed. So it is and so given that, it's a hard thing to broaden out. It's become, I think probably, I haven't looked at numbers, I think probably the gender balance in the field has improved somewhat, but it is still dominated by men. I think somewhere where there has been progress, but this is slightly an advertorial, but I'm a trustee of a charity called the Degrees Initiative, which funds solar geoengineering research in developing countries in the global south. And that's not in order to promulgate the idea that solar geoengineering is a good thing, because that's not the charity's position. It's to say that the global south, which must be at the table in this, some would say must own the table in this, needs to have resident aligned scientists who know what they're talking about. And so, and I think that's been, you know, we funded quite a lot of work, we're funding more work now. I think that's a genuine broadening of the area.
Do you think, you know, basically helping, supporting, promoting science from the global south is being the sort of the primary initial obstacle to getting a wider array of voices, or are there other fundamental obstacles in terms of how people from other parts of the world can get into this debate, the willingness to get into this debate and actually to be heard?
I think that creating a community of scholars in the global south who are taking this seriously is the thing that I am in a position to help with to some extent. I mean, obviously the work's actually done by the brilliant Andy Parker and the other people, but you know, I give some of my time to this because I think it's a really good cause. Does it make everybody heard? No. And I don't know fully how to address that problem. I think it's a problem that we have in a lot of different areas, and yeah, and I understand why friends and colleagues who've signed on to the no use agreement talk about ungovernability, and this is one of their reasons for doing so. I think to say from the outset, as a governance scholar, that something is necessarily ungovernable is either to have a really high normative value of what sort of governability counts as being governable, or a counsel of despair. But I do appreciate that. I mean, you know, it's not as though there's a wide, deep level of discussion of geoengineering anywhere. I mean, there's not one in the global north either. So yeah, I mean, it will always be a problem with deep technical projects.
So the science is obviously one crucial part of it, but also, you know, clearly this is an area which, you know, leans heavily or affects, or is viewed very much through the lens of different ethical and religious beliefs. I know this is sort of an area you've had an interest. To what extent do you see different religious and ethical frameworks influencing and changing how people engage with solar geoengineering? Maybe ideas also around the Anthropocene, you know, is humanity getting good at being a god? Ideas around the difference between technology and nature. How do you see all of these other sort of ideas feeding into the discussion such as exists around solar geoengineering right now?
Oh, well, I mean, it seems to me that solar geoengineering is sort of the well, climate geoengineering in general is sort of like the poster boy for the Anthropocene. Because one thing I didn't mention when we were talking about what had happened since I wrote the book, I did subconsciously focus quite heavily on solar geoengineering. Climate geoengineering has changed hugely, of course, since that book, because the idea that part of the end state of climate action is a net zero world, in which carbon dioxide is being taken out deliberately at the same rate as it's being introduced deliberately, that's, you know, that is a huge change. And I think that in some ways people can see that within a certain sort of stewardship model of the human relationship to the earth that you take out and you put back. Whereas there is something quite alienating and Promethean about solar geoengineering, which goes against many people's, I would say, religious intuitions. I mean, I'm not a scholar of Laudato Si, but I'm pretty sure that if one were to go through it, you would not find much.
That's the papal encyclical, is it?
Yes, yeah. And it's pretty down, as the Catholic Church has every right to be, and historically has been, it's pretty down on sins of pride. And I'm pretty sure that I know which way it would come down on solar geoengineering. And I think that's really problematic. My friend Matt Watson ran a blog, maybe still runs a blog, called The Reluctant Geoengineer. I think an interesting question, for me in my own thinking and writing is, how do you do this in a spirit of, how do you talk about these things in a spirit of humility without just throwing up your hands? Because if you think that these are things that need to be talked about, you absolutely have to try and do it in a spirit of humility. But the enterprise seems so profoundly hubristic that that's very hard to do. And I can't claim that I'm even a lived example of working this through myself. But I think humility seems to me the key thing one can take from greater faith traditions here, more than notions of the correct human relationship to nature, because I think it's clear that ideas about the correct human relationship to nature are always already extremely complex. There's a reason why in the great sociologist Raymond Williams' book, Keywords, nature has, I think, the longest entry. How to define what is natural and what is human nature. These are endless areas of tussling. So nature is I think something that will actually be up for grabs. But I think humility is something that you can take from faith traditions and really try and inject into this discussion, while also remembering what I think of, but I don't know if this is correct, as a more Christian conception of loving kindness, that there must be some level of cherishing involved in this too, that there's a worthy urge to protect at play.
There's also, of course, art, culture, film, books, novels, some of which may be influenced by religion and some of which may not. But we've seen almost the emergence, I guess, almost of a subgenre of cli-fi, itself a subgenre of sci-fi, talking about geoengineering issues. Ministry of the Future by Kim Stanley Robinson, Termination Shot by Neil Stephenson, and so forth. To what extent do they reflect a sense that society is coming closer to this? How important are these books and other movies with geoengineering sort of plots in them in influencing how humanity thinks about these ideas?
I think that's actually going to be a question that you'll have to ask historically, to some extent. But yes, there are now. I mean, way back in the distant past, when I first started thinking about geoengineering, I was actually thinking of writing a novel, and then I decided that my skills lay elsewhere, but my novel might have been not unakin to the third of the recent climate geoengineering novels, Veil by Elliot Pepper. And I actually, I corresponded. Stan Robinson is a friend of mine. I've known Neil Stephenson for a long time, and I've now met Elliot. So it's not, what they have to say has not come as a complete surprise to me, because we've talked it through. I don't know to what extent this will really come home through novels. I don't think that Michael Crichton's god-awful climate skeptic book, the name of which I forget, State of Fear maybe, it reflected the fact that there was climate skepticism in the world, but it didn't, I think, really move it forward particularly. And I think at the margin, it's very interesting the degree to which the climate action community has really taken Stan's book in particular to its heart. But then again, it's interesting that geoengineering happens in Stan's book, but solar geoengineering happens in Stan's book. His love is much more for getting humans involved in the carbon cycle. And it's that bringing together of the economic cycles and the carbon cycle that's sort of like the heart of where his utopian nature is. I suspect, and there are other books, I just as a plug, I would greatly recommend Austral by Paul Macaulay, in which geoengineering has happened and it's changed some things, but not other things. And I think that to some extent, that's a much more realistic way of thinking about the future of geoengineering as being not the center of anything, but something that if it were to happen at all, would happen as an annoyance or a threat or a good thing. But I think that's, to me, that feels a more natural way of dealing with it. But I've enjoyed the novels. I don't know if it's really hitting. When I think about geoengineering in the broader world of arts, I think about it in terms of that ever-changing dialectic of human nature and humanity. So my talks on geoengineering tend to have pictures from the Hudson River School of American landscape painting, where they're also dealing with this question of the savage landscape versus the tamed human world, or some more apocalyptic images from Anselm Kiefer, or the one that always, the work of art that to me speaks most directly to concerns about geoengineering was a wonderful installation at Tate Modern in Britain by Oliver Eliasson called The Climate Project, which was a huge artificial, in many ways, sun filling up the turbine hall of what used to be a fossil fuel power station. And people's reactions to it, both in terms of its uncanniness and in terms of its beauty, were really fascinating to me. So that's where that's where geoengineering art really sort of like, for me, comes to a pinnacle, and something that I think Oliver had no idea that he did not in any way intentionally mean to be making a commentary on geoengineering.
From your experience interviewing policymakers, legislators, international negotiators, obviously, as you do this work, you'll have a bunch of texts and briefing notes and positions. But do you think in the back of the mind, there's also the sense of where would I be in this novel? Where would I be in this piece of art? What piece of art am I creating here? Do you think there's a sense of which people are also driven by those considerations when working out how you might go about governance or taking decisions about deployment or research or so forth?
Wow, that's a wonderful question. I have no idea. I would suspect that self-image through novels isn't as domain specific as that. And I could imagine talking to someone who has in the back of their mind the idea that they're part of War and Peace, or someone who thinks at the back of their mind that they're part of a novel by Disraeli, or a novel by Michel Houellebecq. You know, I'm not sure that I would expect people to take their cues from fiction in quite that way.
Maybe from a more lowbrow way, I'm thinking also of Star Wars, like Darth Vader, Luke Skywalker, or Han Solo. That's there are other
no, and it's interesting that this is probably complete, but I'm very interested in the way that science fiction tends to deal with climate as a fixed thing, and in fact an incredibly monotonous thing. So in Star Wars, you have a desert planet, you have an ice planet, you have a swamp planet, you have a planet without a surface at all, with Lando Calrissian tooling around. Maybe he's doing something in that stratosphere that we should be told about up there in Cloud City. But in fact, I suppose if there's the novel that people point to as a novel of ecological science fiction that is interesting here is Dune and the film of Dune, which are very powerful meditations on power and the environment, even though in an environmental science sense, Dune makes no sense whatsoever. It's very powerful. I mean, you know, sort of like ecological scientists I deeply admire, so like reread Dune on a regular basis. And in later Dune books, spoiler, Arrakis does get terraformed, so it does get geoengineered. And so maybe Mr. Villeneuve's second or third Dune films will bring this out a little further, the question of whether one should change the world or not.
What one journey that I know people who tackle with this subject have gone on is sort of the changing sense of the likelihood that we will see some form of attempted deployment of geoengineering in our lifetimes, and in what time frame that might happen. Do you have at the back of your mind, obviously no one has a crystal ball, but at the back of your mind a sense that we might see, you know, significant advances in this field in the next 10, 20, 50, 100 years, and what the sort of precipitating events might be that actually move this from still a, you know, somewhat theoretical discussion to a very real and practical decision to be made?
Well, I think given the current state of debate, we have to start thinking about large-scale carbon dioxide removal as happening. I mean, let me be generous to myself, as happening within my lifetime, which I'll take out to 2040. You have to, I mean, you have to think that unless everyone who says net zero is just full of it, that's got to be something happening, and at which point the you know, the die will be cast, and that you are setting out towards a world where eventually, and maybe not for centuries, but eventually the climate, as in the level of carbon dioxide, is under human control. And, you know, there will be a choice in such a world as to whether you were to go for 400 parts per million or 350 parts per million, to take a number that's close to many hearts. So I think that I mean, you know, there are already very small direct air capture organizations. There is already various sorts of renewable, sustainable and regenerative agriculture looking at soil. There are lots of often not very good afforestation projects. So that side of things, that side of sort of like doing stuff primarily to change the climate in the way you want, yeah, that's going to happen, and that's going to happen within my lifetime. Solar geoengineering, I genuinely don't know. It's one of the reasons why the topic is interesting. My sort of like default position is that it won't happen on a very large scale, and that in 2100, 2120, people will look back and say, you know, we might have saved ourselves quite a lot of hassle if we'd looked at that harder. And I suppose that's the world that I'm trying to, the world that I'd like to see my work as trying to avert. I don't want a world with solar geoengineering come what may. I don't, but I also don't want a world to look back. I don't want the future generations to look back and say, I wish they'd thought about this just a bit more thoroughly.
I just wanted to end on a note of how you tackle, or thinking about how society tackles anxiety, grief, climate grief. I mean, professionals working in climate and dealing with these issues, you know, you obviously talk about these issues and engage with them in a sort of a rational sense, but every so often there's a wow, this is really something dramatic going on and this has an emotional impact. And how to, you know, different people have different ways of dealing with that emotional impact in terms of hanging on to hope or staving off despair. How do you think about those issues? How important is the question of tackling, you know, anxiety and grief, you know, coming over the next decade going to be, and how do you actually deal with that working in your work for, you know, influential media outlets?
I found it harder, frankly, Mark. It's a good question. I found it harder when I was doing some work in the early zeros on global public health. And I really admired the public health officials who I came across in that work. But when I just thought about the real ongoing situation of millions of unnecessary deaths every year, that did actually have a genuinely bad effect on how I was thinking about other stuff. In general, I tend to think that, certainly in my lived experience, strong emotional reactions and issues probably have, if not deeper causes closer to home, certainly causes which are more amenable to change closer to home. Because if you build your notion of what your good life is on the basis of things over which you do not have any control, I think you're taking a bad bet on the universe. But there are also, I mean, there is a sense also that one can be in one's work today part of a generation or a set of generations now that is for the first time taking a different attitude towards the earth and the human role in it, and an attitude that, with some optimistic assumptions, not about the basic human nature, but about what the nature of some human societies might work out okay. And that can be uplifting. I remember, I mean, you know, the sort of like memory of all this for me is being in Washington, DC, in a bar on the top of the Hotel Washington with my friend Andrew Lawler. If he ever heard me call him Andy, he would kill me. With my friend Andrew Lawler, and we were looking out basically at the White House and at a spectacular sunset. And I remember saying to Andrew, you know, that's Mount Pinatubo. That's the stratosphere. I hadn't thought about solar geoengineering at all, I think, at that point. But knowing that geophysical events around the world could lend a particular atmosphere to a particular consideration of politics in what is probably still the most important square kilometer of the earth politically, that has always stayed with me. And the idea that there are ways that this could come out a bit better, that there are, that in the words of my friend Francis Spufford, his wonderful novel Golden Hill, that more, no, it's not his novel Golden Hill, his wonderful book Unapologetics, there's more that can be there's more can be mended than you would think. And that's not a bad thing to take into your emotional life.
On that note, thank you so much, Oliver Morton.
Thank you, Mark.
Part of C2GTalk.
Thank you very much.